There was a duck in my kitchen. Not a ceramic one or a joke, a real, live, angry duck standing in 3 inches of swamp water that had somehow surged through my back patio door. It looked me dead in the eye like I owed it rent. I stood there, soaked to my knees, holding a wrench and a half-eaten sandwich, and all I could think was, this all started because Karen wanted a pond. A pond that was never supposed to drain into my yard. A pond that turned my workshop into a frog habitat and my herb garden into a mosquito breeding center. And the HOA? They said it was just nature doing her thing. Well, nature was about to get a course correction, with Karen and the entire HOA board right in the splash zone. 2 months earlier, things were quiet. Too quiet. In my experience, when the HOA is quiet, something terrible is brewing, usually with clipboards and condescending smiles. I live in a small gated community outside Austin, Texas. Nothing fancy, just a ranch-style home on a corner lot with a tidy little backyard and the kind of peace that makes you forget the world for a while. That peace ended when the HOA announced the Natural Beauty Initiative, a new project spearheaded by Karen, the HOA president with the charm of a DMV printer and the flexibility of concrete. She pitched the idea at the monthly HOA meeting with her signature flair, using phrases like eco-harmony, waterfront rejuvenation, and just imagine the koi. She unveiled a watercolor sketch that looked like it was done by a drunk raccoon, showing a large pond right near the community clubhouse. The board clapped like trained seals. I raised one concern, just one. I asked, "Where does the runoff go?" Karen blinked like I had spoken another language. She flipped through her notes, muttered something about French drains, and then waved me off with a tight-lipped smile. "Don't worry, David. The engineers we hired are professionals. Everything is compliant." I later found out those engineers were her cousin Larry and a landscaping company with a 3-star Yelp rating and a criminal record for illegal dumping. Construction began the next week. Big machines rolled in, tore up the center green, and within days they had dug a pond so deep it might as well have been a crater for a meteor. They lined it with cheap stone, slapped on a fake, natural waterfall made of PVC and foam rocks, and called it a day. The problem became clear almost immediately. Every time it rained, and in spring, that meant every few days, the pond filled up and overflowed. And guess where the overflow went? Straight into my backyard. At first, I thought it was just some minor puddling. I moved my outdoor furniture to higher ground and grumbled. But then the puddles became streams. The streams became full-blown marsh trenches. And then, one morning, I stepped outside and my foot sank to the ankle in sludge. My raised garden beds were underwater. The firewood pile floated like a shipwreck. My beloved workshop, the one I'd spent 2 years building, now had standing water covering the entire floor. That was the first time I marched over to the HOA office and demanded a meeting. Karen was sitting at her desk eating a yogurt like she had just solved world peace. I told her what was happening. She smiled, nodded, and then, without a hint of irony, said, "That's just nature, David. The pond has to drain somewhere. Water finds its path." I asked if the path had to be through my garage. She chuckled like I was being silly. "David, you live at the lowest point in the community. It's just unfortunate geography. Maybe install a sump pump." And then she went back to her yogurt. I tried the city next. I filed a formal complaint with the zoning department, then called the water management office. But when they found out it was a privately managed HOA pond, they backed away like it was radioactive. "You'll have to resolve it internally," they told me. Internally? Internally was Karen and her army of board members who thought algae was an aesthetic choice. The next HOA meeting was packed. A few of my neighbors had started to notice their yards were soggy too, but Karen brushed them off with more fake technical terms and a slideshow of literal ducks, as if waterfowl made everything okay. I tried to speak up again, but she cut me off with a gavel and said I was being combative. Me? I was the one wearing rubber boots inside my own house. By this point, I wasn't just annoyed. I was furious. I had done everything right. I'd filed reports, sent emails, tried to reason, and in return, I'd gotten nothing but smug smiles and damp socks. One night, after bailing out the workshop for the third time in a week, I stood in my backyard under a drizzle and stared at the direction the water came from. I followed it with my eyes, tracing its path across my sodden lawn, past the overfilled French drain, through a poorly hidden pipe sticking up near the HOA fence line. That was when I saw it. The pipe wasn't just draining by accident. It had been angled intentionally. It was directing overflow water exactly toward my property. I stood there for a long moment, letting the realization sink in. This wasn't nature. This wasn't accidental. This was a calculated move. Someone, Karen, had made the conscious decision to dump their water problem onto me. That's when everything inside me changed. I stopped being the reasonable guy, the quiet engineer who liked his herbs and his power tools. I became a man with a mission. The next morning, I started drawing diagrams. I pulled up the property schematic. I analyzed the slope, the volume of the pond, the rate of overflow. I didn't yell. I didn't argue. I went quiet. I went technical. And while Karen planned her big spring pool party, I was planning something too. Because if they wanted a pond and thought my backyard was fair game, then I was going to give them exactly what they asked for. Except this time, they wouldn't need koi fish, they'd need lifeguards. By the time that duck waddled into my kitchen, I had already begun phase 1. And Karen? She had no idea the storm she'd just unleashed. The HOA thought they were playing with water, but they'd forgotten who they were messing with. I build flood control systems for a living. They turned my yard into a swamp. I was going to turn their pride and joy into a swamp-themed disaster zone they'd never forget. Let the games begin. The smell was the first thing that made people stop pretending everything was fine. It started as a faint, sour odor drifting through the cul-de-sac early in the morning. Then it got worse. Stronger, thicker, like wet dog fur mixed with pond algae and rotting leaves. By the end of the week, it clung to the neighborhood like a wet blanket, especially around my backyard, which now looked more like a marsh than a lawn. The birds had left. The bugs had moved in. And the HOA was still acting like this was some kind of natural oasis instead of the ecological disaster it was rapidly becoming. After that humiliating HOA meeting, I decided to go fully underground with my efforts. I didn't argue. I didn't show up to meetings with muddy boot. I started doing what I do best, investigating. I spent the next 2 weeks quietly documenting everything. I purchased a water level monitor and installed it discreetly in my backyard. Every time it rained, I charted how quickly the runoff surged in and how long it stagnated. I took drone footage, not just of my property but of the entire runoff system. What I saw confirmed what I had suspected. The overflow pipe from the pond didn't just happen to lead in my direction. It had been extended, redirected, and buried under a thin layer of sod, sneaking behind the shrub line like a snake. And the pipe was new. I found receipts in the HOA financial documents from a local landscaping service, paid for with HOA funds for aquatic retention extensions. That phrase alone sounded suspicious. I dug deeper into the contractor. Turns out it was a shell company. Just a dinky 2-person outfit run by Karen's cousin Jeff, who wasn't licensed for drainage or pond construction. His last job was an above-ground pool installation that had collapsed after 3 weeks. I knew I needed to bring in a real expert, so I called in a favor from an old college buddy, Malik, who now worked as a hydrology consultant for the state. He showed up with a coffee in one hand and a tool bag in the other. After 10 minutes in my backyard, he shook his head and said, "They funneled it right to you, no question." He pointed out the shallow gradient and the sloppily connected PVC extensions. This wasn't just bad design. This was deliberate. We walked over to the pond. From the outside, it looked decent enough, clean water, some planted reeds, even a few fake lily pads. But underneath, Malik pointed out major issues. The water level had no proper containment. No overflow basin. No filtration. No emergency diverter. The whole thing was a flooding time bomb. When I asked how much rain it would take for the pond to spill over, he gave me a number. It was lower than I expected. 1 thunderstorm. That's all it would take. And there was one in the forecast. At this point, the neighborhood was starting to murmur. One of the neighbors on the eastern slope, Julia, stopped me while I was walking my dog. She asked if my grass was dying too. I told her it was already dead. She said her flower beds were wilting from standing moisture. Another neighbor mentioned frogs, hundreds of them, chirping at night like a symphony from hell. But the final straw came when a toddler from across the street fell in a puddle that had pooled between 2 homes and came out covered in green slime. The mother posted photos in the neighborhood forum and tagged the HOA. Karen responded in her usual tone-deaf way, claiming the water was clean and an important part of our local biome. She even attached a stock photo of a smiling child next to a pond. Nobody was smiling now. That weekend, Malik helped me run dye tests. We poured a non-toxic blue tracer into the edge of the HOA pond and waited. 3 hours later, it showed up in my sump pit plain as day. It was undeniable. We recorded the whole thing. Video, timestamps, elevation data, drainage map. I compiled a report thicker than a legal thriller and submitted it to the City Environmental Review Office. But because it was private land, the city couldn't do much unless there was a health violation or active damage to municipal infrastructure. That was frustrating, but not surprising. Still, I wasn't out of moves. I shifted focus from documentation to strategy. Karen had been planning a massive pool party for the HOA to celebrate the success of the Natural Beauty Initiative. Invitations had already gone out. Caterers were booked. Even a local jazz band was lined up. I watched from my back porch as volunteers prepped the area. Inflatable flamingos floated cheerfully in the clean, chlorinated water of the community pool. They had no idea what was coming. Before anything else, I needed to understand their pride and joy, the pool. I got a layout from the city archives. Built 5 years ago, it had standard overflow drains, 2 main skimmer lines, and a single backwash outlet that led into the stormwater line. But here was the interesting part. There was a slight uphill slope between the pond and the pool. Normally, that would mean no flow unless aided by gravity. But what if I introduced a new variable? What if I created a bypass? One that allowed the pond's overflow to be redirected, just slightly, but precisely enough to overwhelm the pool filtration system. It wouldn't even need to be permanent. Just a single night. One storm. That's all it would take. To prepare, I quietly installed a narrow trench near the HOA shrub line, well disguised under mulch. Using a directional trenching tool Malik had access to through his firm, we created a pathway hidden from plain sight that connected the overflow runoff area to a secondary storm drain near the pool. This would allow the pond's surge to bypass my property entirely and hit the pool's drainage at a low angle, enough to cause overflow, especially if a storm hit hard. And if it didn't? I had a manual pressure release setup built using an old irrigation valve that would give the whole system a little artificial encouragement if nature didn't do its part. Karen, meanwhile, was busy bragging in the HOA newsletter about the pond's success. She even named it. She called it Serenity Lake. That name would not age well. By the time the newsletter hit our mailboxes, I had already finished Phase 1. The trench was covered. The valve was tested. The calculations double-checked. I was ready. All I needed now was a little rain. The forecast didn't disappoint. By Thursday, the radar was lit up like a Christmas tree. A storm system moving in from the Gulf promised heavy rainfall and flash flooding warnings across our county. The HOA didn't postpone the party. Karen, ever confident, sent out a group message saying the storm would pass quickly and that they had ample water control infrastructure in place. That sentence made me laugh out loud. She had no idea what was really about to happen. The night before the party, the rain began. It started light, then picked up speed. I stood by the valve at midnight, flashlight in hand, watching as the water built pressure behind the trench line. I could see the pond swelling, its edges already starting to seep. 2:17 a.m., I turned the valve. It was quiet at first. A trickle. Then a rush. Then a roar. Water surged through the trench, bypassed my yard completely, and followed its new route, straight toward the HOA pool's auxiliary drains. And I went inside, made a cup of tea, and waited for sunrise. The stage was set. The camera system I installed would capture every angle. Karen had flooded my life for weeks. Now, it was my turn to return the favor, with interest. It started with a low gurgling sound, barely noticeable beneath the patter of morning rain. But within minutes, the tranquil illusion of the HOA pool area cracked like a dropped champagne flute. The sun hadn't even fully risen when the first guest showed up for party setup. It was Cindy, one of Karen's fiercely loyal board members, who arrived with pastel balloons and a folding table. She stopped dead in her tracks when she saw the pool. At first, she thought it was fog. Then she saw the color. What should have been crystal blue chlorinated water had turned a sickly green-brown, with odd clumps floating near the skimmers and what appeared to be cattail fragments bobbing at the shallow end. She dropped the balloon box. Moments later, her scream echoed across the cul-de-sac like a morning siren. I was standing behind my kitchen window, coffee in hand, watching the scene unfold in real time. The camera I had mounted on the backside of my workshop sent me a live feed, and the angle was perfect. You could see the trickle of pond water still feeding the pool's overflow drain like a patient four-line delivering disaster. Karen showed up 15 minutes later, wearing a white visor, floral capris, and a smile that evaporated the moment she turned the corner. Her eyes scanned the scene, lips curling in disbelief as she took in the algae blooms swirling in her once perfect pool. Then, she stepped back, took a photo, and whipped out her phone. The HOA group chat blew up almost instantly. As neighbors began arriving, it was clear this was no ordinary mishap. A foul stench had settled over the deck. The decorative tiki torches Karen had set up were now surrounded by puddles of swampy runoff. Ducks were actually waddling along the concrete path, flapping and splashing in the filthy water like they'd been invited. A brave neighbor poked the surface with a pool net and pulled up something that looked suspiciously like a frog. Another scooped a piece of driftwood from the deep end and shouted, "Why does this smell like a lake?" Karen, ever desperate to control the narrative, called for an emergency board huddle near the clubhouse. I knew from my cameras that the arguing had already begun. One member, Julia, the same woman who'd asked me about dyeing grass the week before, was pointing toward the pond and waving her arms. Another member accused Karen of using HOA funds for unapproved landscaping work. Karen pushed back with her usual haughty confidence, insisting this was the result of natural groundwater migration and had nothing to do with the pond. That's when Julia pulled out her phone and showed everyone a video. It was my video. The one of the dye test. I had uploaded it anonymously the night before and sent it to a few trusted neighbors. The moment that bright blue water had appeared in my sump pit was caught on camera, clear and undeniable. There was even a timestamp and drone footage showing the pipe buried behind the shrubs. The board fell silent as Karen turned pale. The evidence was damning, and it was spreading faster than the pond's algae. By late morning, parents were pulling their kids away from the pool area. The jazz band canceled. The caterer arrived, saw the scene, and left immediately, refusing to unload anything. Karen was now in full meltdown mode, yelling about sabotage and liability. She tried to pin the whole thing on me, claiming I had tampered with community property. That's when I decided to walk over and say hello. I strolled in wearing my work boots, a clean shirt, and a smile so calm it unnerved her. The moment she saw me, her face twisted with fury. "You did this," she hissed. "I know it was you. You flooded the pool." I kept my voice measured and polite. "Actually, Karen, you flooded my backyard first. I just helped the water find a more suitable destination. Around us, neighbors were whispering, watching. Some were laughing. One man clapped slowly. Karen started ranting about pressing charges and calling the police, but before she could dial, I handed her a folder. Inside were printed screenshots, video stills, engineering calculations, and a notarized copy of a drainage complaint. I told her I'd already submitted a copy to the city, to the HOA insurance provider, and to a local investigative reporter who just happened to live in the next community over. Her hands trembled as she flipped through the papers, her jaw tightening with every page. Then came the final blow. I had obtained an internal HOA document showing the payment for the illegal drainage installation to her cousin's company, complete with her signature authorizing the work. She stared at me, silent for the first time in weeks. All the bravado, the smug superiority, the fake environmental buzzwords, it all drained from her face. Behind us, the murky pool shimmered under gray skies, now a symbol of her failed ego trip. I turned and walked away, not saying another word, just leaving the sound of her breathing shallow and fast behind me. By afternoon, the city finally responded. A water quality inspector arrived, saw the pool, and immediately declared it a public health concern. The entire area was taped off. Hazmat signs went up. Karen stood beside the inspector, trying to look concerned, but it was too late. Photos were already making rounds online. Someone posted a side-by-side image of the pond and the pool with the caption, "From nature to nasty in 10 days." It went viral. The city's environmental office opened a formal inquiry. That triggered a broader investigation into the HOA's operations. Emails were pulled. Financial records were reviewed. And like a badly built dam, it all started to break apart. Karen was forced to step down within the week. She claimed it was for personal reasons, but everyone knew the truth. Her cousin's company was banned from doing business in the state, and several HOA board members were named in a civil complaint filed by affected residents, including me. But the fallout didn't stop there. Neighbors began meeting informally to discuss reforms. A petition to dissolve the current HOA and elect a new board gained traction fast. For the first time, people were speaking out about years of shady fees, arbitrary citations, and favoritism. The flood had washed more than water into the HOA. It had uncovered everything rotten hiding beneath its surface. And as for the pool, it had to be drained, sanitized, and completely resurfaced. The pond? That too was filled in, after the city found its construction violated at least 4 code. The ducks returned briefly, confused and displaced, but eventually moved on once the fake lake dried up. I, on the other hand, stood on my now dry backyard lawn, finally reclaimed, finally quiet, and looked out over the neighborhood that was finally waking up. The final irony? The HOA tried to bill me for unauthorized trenching. I sent them a copy of the flood report and a letter from my lawyer. They never tried again. I went back to rebuilding my workshop, replanting my garden, and repairing what had been drowned under weeks of indifference and arrogance. But I also made sure one small reminder remained, an engraved stone I placed near the edge of my yard, facing the direction of the now demolished pond. It simply read, "Water finds its path." The next few days felt like living in the eye of a storm that had already made landfall but was still circling, quietly ripping through the structure of everything the HOA thought it had control over. The once pristine pool area, now taped off and surrounded by temporary fencing, stood like a monument to failure. The muddy water had been pumped out, but the algae had left a permanent green film across the concrete, and the smell lingered like an insult. Even the flamingo inflatables were slumped over in the corner, deflated and defeated. What used to be the pride of the community had become an open embarrassment, and word had spread fast. The city inspector's report made it official: unpermitted drainage work, environmental negligence, misuse of community funds, and a complete breakdown in stormwater management policy. Karen's resignation didn't buy her the sympathy she clearly hoped for. She posted a long-winded message on the HOA bulletin board about stepping away to focus on family matters and personal healing, but it was too late. The damage was visible in every yard, every puddle, every broken trust. Neighbors who once sat quietly at meetings started speaking up. Even the ones who had previously sided with Karen were now turning on her, some because of the smell, others because of the financial risk now hanging over the neighborhood. There were whispers about a lawsuit forming, a class action by homeowners who had experienced damage to their property. I didn't confirm or deny that I was part of it. I just kept watering my recovering garden, fixing up my toolshed, and letting the chaos play out from a safe distance. Then came the real surprise. The HOA board called for an emergency vote to appoint a temporary president. Nobody expected the outcome. A retired city drainage inspector named Ed Monroe, who had lived quietly on the west end of the community for 15 years, threw his name in. Ed wasn't flashy. He wasn't loud. But he had something no other board member had: actual experience. The vote wasn't even close. Ed won by a landslide. Karen didn't even show up to the meeting, but her name came up anyway when Ed opened the floor for grievances. One by one, neighbors stood up and listed everything she had done. Fines for mailbox paint colors, threats over garden gnomes, shady contractor kickbacks, her personal use of HOA funds for landscaping on her own property, and of course the pond. Ed took it all in with a calm, serious expression. Then he said something that surprised everyone. He asked me to meet with him privately. I expected a lecture or maybe some thinly veiled threat in case I stirred more trouble, but when we sat down in his garage with 2 old lawn chairs and a pitcher of iced tea, he simply said, "You were right to do what you did." I blinked, not expecting that. He explained that he'd quietly been monitoring the HOA for years, watching as Karen grew more emboldened and more reckless. He'd seen the warning signs, even submitted a few quiet complaints, but the board always outvoted him. After the pond incident, he decided enough was enough. He showed me some of his own records, meeting notes, emails, budget discrepancies, an entire binder full of HOA corruption. And then he asked for my help. Not with sabotage or drama, but with fixing things. I agreed, but under one condition. I wanted nothing to do with titles or meetings or HOA politics. I'd help him design a new drainage system, one that wouldn't destroy anyone's yard, and I'd help him locate every faulty installation Karen's cousin had been responsible for. That was it. He nodded and said, "That's more than enough." Over the next 2 weeks, I worked quietly with Ed to map out the real hydrology of the community. We found broken pipes, blocked drains, and more buried PVC than anyone should ever see in their life. At one point, we uncovered a whole section of French drain that had been installed completely upside down. The water had nowhere to go except straight into nearby foundations. It was a miracle nobody's basement had collapsed. We drew up a plan, submitted it to the city, and with their approval, began a full reconstruction. It was paid for using emergency HOA reserve funds, something Karen had always claimed didn't exist. They did exist. She had just been funneling them into vanity projects and backyard upgrade. In the meantime, the city's environmental department filed a formal complaint against Karen's cousin's company, and within a month, their license was revoked. A small victory, but a satisfying one. The contractor vanished from the neighborhood without a word, leaving behind a half-finished patio at Karen's house and an unpaid bill from the local supply yard. Poetic justice if I'd ever seen it. Karen herself had gone quiet, but she wasn't gone. I saw her once from a distance, walking her dog down the far edge of the block, sunglasses on, head down, pretending she wasn't the most hated person in the community. Rumor had it she'd tried to run for a position on a local homeowner association council outside our neighborhood. That application didn't make it past the first interview once her name was Googled. Her pond fiasco had become something of a legend, and not the flattering kind. People had even started calling it the swampening. One particularly satisfying moment came when the new HOA team hosted a community cleanup event. They were replanting the central green, tearing out the last remnants of the fake pond, and returning it to a low-maintenance native garden. Someone suggested a plaque to commemorate the transformation. The vote passed, and a small stone marker was installed. It read, "Never again without consensus." It didn't mention names, but everyone knew who it was about. The best part came shortly after that when Ed called to tell me about the final city report. Not only had the HOA been found liable for improper stormwater management, but the city had also declared the area around the old pond a restoration site. That meant the HOA would have to follow strict guidelines for water redirection, maintenance, and runoff filtration going forward. No more secret pipes. No more flooding someone else's property and calling it eco-harmony. As a final gesture, Ed had an idea. He said it was something symbolic, a little funny, a little pointed. The community pool, now fully restored and sparkling clean, would be hosting its reopening. And at the edge of the deck, he wanted to install a decorative sculpture. Something small. Something that reminded people of what happens when you ignore the consequences of careless planning. I told him I had just the thing. From my own yard, I retrieved one of the busted PVC elbows I had dug up from the illegal runoff pipe. I cleaned it, mounted it to a small stone base, and engraved 3 simple words along the side. Respect the flow. The sculpture now sits by the pool. People smile when they see it. Kids run past it without thinking twice. But those who were here, those who remember, understand what it means. It's a warning, a joke, and a memory. Just like the whole mess. And when I walk past it in the evening, I feel something I hadn't felt in weeks. Relief. Not just because the swamp is gone. Not just because Karen is no longer in charge. But because sometimes, just sometimes, the little guy with the muddy yard, the flooded workshop, and the angry duck in the kitchen actually wins. The rain came again, exactly 6 weeks after the flood. Not a storm this time, just a long steady soak that rolled through the afternoon and into the early evening. I sat on my porch with a warm cup of tea, watching the droplets slide down the new gutter system we had just finished installing. The backyard was dry. My garden beds were raised higher now, my toolshed had been reinforced and resealed, and the formerly squishy grass beneath my feet was firm and solid once more. I listened for the telltale gurgle that used to signal another unwanted pond forming at the edge of my property, but all I heard were birds and the quiet patter of clean, well-managed rain. It was a simple thing, but after everything that had happened, it felt like a monumental victory. The HOA had changed more in those 6 weeks than it had in the previous 6 years. The board was now composed of people who actually listened. Ed Monroe, who had initially stepped in as a temporary leader, was now officially voted president by unanimous consent. He didn't want the job for long, but he promised to stay at least a year to make sure the reforms stuck. Under his direction, new transparency policies were put in place. Every HOA meeting was now streamed online, financial records were open to all residents, and decisions had to be backed by at least 2 certified contractors and 1 independent consultant. Karen's reign of one-woman authority was finally over. The repairs funded by the city grant and HOA insurance had finally wrapped up. Several houses had their landscaping restored, 1 family got their water-damaged basement refinished, and the community center underwent a much-needed overhaul. The swampy pond was filled in and replaced with drought-resistant landscaping designed to handle runoff naturally. It was low-maintenance, native, and, most importantly, dry. The area no longer reeked of algae and decay. Instead, it buzzed with bees, birds, and occasional laughter from kids running through the new wildflower path Ed had helped plant himself. As for Karen, her presence in the neighborhood became more like a ghost story than a reality. Her house was up for sale before the month ended. No goodbye note, no apology, just a cardboard sign that read private showing by appointment and a rusted lawn flamingo that had survived the pond debacle now tipping sideways in her flower bed. Rumors swirled that she had moved in with her sister 3 towns over, where she was taking time to reflect. More likely, she was looking for the next place where nobody had heard her name yet. But even if she found it, the internet doesn't forget. Her name had been mentioned in the Environmental Department's public disciplinary report, and local forums had screenshots of her old HOA newsletters, complete with her fake environmental jargon and that ridiculous name she gave the pond, Serenity Lake. A local meme page even started using that phrase to describe any project doomed to fail. One afternoon, I passed by a neighbor who gave me a small nod and said thank you. That same day, a kid riding a bike shouted, "Hey, you're the guy who saved the pool." I didn't correct him. Technically, I had helped destroy it before helping it get fixed, but I wasn't going to ruin his hero narrative. Word had spread through the neighborhood that I'd played a role in getting the old drainage system exposed and forcing the change. I never publicly admitted to rerouting the pond overflow. I didn't have to. Most people assumed it, and those who were grateful didn't care how it had happened, only that it had. The best moment came during the annual HOA community dinner, now held indoors in the newly remodeled clubhouse. It had been postponed because of the initial flood damage, but once things were repaired, the neighborhood decided to go all in on making it a positive event. The turnout was bigger than expected. Ed gave a short speech thanking everyone for their patience and their voice. Then he surprised everyone by unveiling a small token of appreciation. It was a plaque, modest and clean, placed in a frame next to a photo of the pre-flood pool and the post-flood cleanup crew. Engraved into the metal were the words, "Sometimes it takes one voice to reroute the flood." He looked at me when he said it. A few people clapped. Someone whistled. I raised my glass and nodded, pretending I hadn't just felt an unexpected lump in my throat. Later that evening, while people were mingling and eating, Ed pulled me aside. He said he had one more surprise. He walked me around to the back of the clubhouse, past the new drainage grates, and showed me the edge of the community pool where a stone pedestal had been installed. It was about knee-height, topped with a repurposed PVC fitting, polished and cleaned, with an inscription that read "Respect the flow." I recognized it instantly. It was the same broken pipe I had offered him weeks earlier. I had thought it would sit somewhere obscure, but no. He had made it permanent, part of the official landscape. A little joke, a little truth, a little reminder. I laughed, harder than I had in a while. It was perfect, and so life returned to something resembling normal. My backyard was no longer a marsh. My kitchen was duck-free. The HOA no longer loomed like a threat, but functioned like it was supposed to. People started putting up porch decorations again without fear of fines. One guy built a raised planter without submitting paperwork first, and nobody cared. The community began feeling like a community again, not a battleground. It didn't erase everything that had happened, but it rewrote what came next. And that, to me, was enough. A few weeks after the dinner, I received a small envelope in the mail with no return address. Inside was a folded sheet of paper and a photo. The paper was blank except for one line typed in all caps. I get it now. The photo was of Karen's front lawn, now overrun with weeds and a clearly dead ornamental pond basin in the corner. The photo had been taken from inside a car, and judging by the cracked dashboard and the angle, she hadn't even stepped out to take it. She had mailed it to me anonymously. Or maybe she just couldn't bring herself to sign her name. Either way, I tucked it in a drawer and left it there. The thing about water is, it doesn't care about excuses or titles or neighborhood authority. It doesn't care about good intentions or bad landscaping. Water moves where the land lets it. And if you don't respect that, it will carve its own path, whether you like it or not. That was Karen's mistake. She tried to control something she didn't understand and ignored the people who did. All because she wanted a pond that looked pretty in her newsletter photo. All because she thought she could outsmart the terrain. Me? I didn't outsmart it. I listened to it. I studied it. I worked with it. And when I realized what was happening, I didn't fight the water. I gave it direction. A little nudge, a little redirection, and the water did the rest. On the final morning of spring, I stepped into my backyard, where the sunlight hit the new paving stones in soft golden light. My herbs had returned, stronger now, a mix of basil, mint, and rosemary dancing in the breeze. I heard a neighbor mowing, another trimming hedges, someone hammering something cheerful nearby. The storm had passed, both literal and figurative, and the land was finally settled. The path had changed, and so had everything else,